Blood trickled down my father's face as the HOA officer forced him face down on our driveway entrance. At 87 years old, my dad, a decorated Vietnam veteran who'd survived 2 wars, was being handcuffed on his own property while the officer held him firmly by the arm. I watched from the doorway as this fake cop knelt beside him, the Harmony Glen Estates patrol vehicle's lights flashing in our driveway. Rules apply to everyone, even war heroes, the officer sneered as neighbors recorded the assault. He had no idea that in less than 24 hours, his entire HOA empire would come crashing down, or that he was handcuffing the father of someone trained to dismantle regimes far more dangerous than his pathetic power trip. For nearly 4 decades, my father, Colonel Richard Caldwell, had been a fixture in Evergreen Hills. His modest single-story home stood out not for its size, but for the meticulously maintained garden and the American flag that had flown continuously since 1986. After serving 15 years in Special Forces, including a decade with Delta Force conducting classified operations in places most Americans never hear about, I returned home last spring. Mom had passed after a battle with cancer, and Dad, now 87, was beginning to struggle with the physical demands of home maintenance, though his fiercely independent spirit remained undeterred. "The day I can't care for my own home is the day they can put me in the ground," he told me firmly when I suggested helping. We compromised. I take the guest house behind the main home, giving us both independence while allowing me to handle the heavier work. I'd expected challenges caring for an aging parent, but I never anticipated our greatest threat would come from within our own neighborhood. The friendly community where neighbors once helped each other had transformed dramatically. 2 years earlier, a new homeowners association board had been elected, led by Jonathan Sterling, a former corporate attorney with political ambitions and a reputation for ruthlessness. Under his leadership, the HOA rules had expanded from a reasonable 5-page document to a bewildering 32-page manifesto of restrictions. Paint colors, mailbox designs, lawn ornaments, even the types of flowers permitted in gardens all now fell under draconian regulations that seemed designed to generate violations rather than improve the community. "These people think they're running their own private dictatorship," Dad remarked one evening, tossing yet another violation notice onto the kitchen table. "I've owned this house since before there even was an HOA." The warning signs began subtly. First came letters about Dad's pickup truck, which occasionally sat at the edge of our driveway when family visited. Then came citations about his bird feeders attracting nuisance wildlife, and most infuriatingly, his American flag being oversized, according to newly implemented guidelines. "Been flying that same flag for 35 years, Dad muttered. Suddenly it's a violation. Each citation arrived with an escalating fine, $50, then $100, then $250. None of these regulations had existed in the original HOA agreement he'd signed. I attempted diplomacy. First, at the monthly HOA meeting, I calmly raised concerns about aggressive enforcement targeting elderly residents. Jonathan Sterling presided from the head of the conference table, surrounded by board members who seemed selected more for their loyalty than their community spirit. "Rules exist for everyone's benefit, Mr. Caldwell," Sterling explained with practiced smoothness. "Property values depend on consistency and compliance. There's nothing courteous about threatening an 87-year-old veteran with thousands in fines for having a bird feeder," I replied. Sterling's smile never reached his eyes. "No one is above the rules, Mr. Caldwell. Not even decorated veterans. Perhaps at your father's age, it might be time to consider a more manageable living situation." The threat was unmistakable: comply or get out. Days later, the HOA compliance vehicle appeared, a white SUV with official-looking decals and light bars, clearly designed to mimic police vehicles. Behind the wheel sat Gary Tate, a former mall security guard now carrying the title, head of HOA enforcement. The situation deteriorated rapidly when several elderly residents on fixed incomes began receiving letters threatening foreclosure for unpaid HOA fines. Evelyn Hayes, a 78-year-old widow living 3 doors down, showed up at our door in tears, clutching a legal notice. They say I owe almost $12,000 in fines and fees, she sobbed. That's most of my savings. All because my roses are the wrong shade of red and my mailbox isn't the approved design. This pattern seemed oddly targeted, primarily affecting older residents living in original homes on larger lots, while newer residents in recently built houses received minimal scrutiny. Something felt calculated about the enforcement, but I couldn't yet prove it. I began documenting everything, photographing our property daily, recording all interactions with HOA personnel, and collecting similar accounts from neighbors. My military training and intelligence gathering proved unexpectedly useful in suburban America. Then came the community newsletter announcing that Evergreen Hills had contracted with a professional security service authorized to detain rule violators until compliance is confirmed. The newsletter featured a photo of Tate in his pseudo-police uniform, standing beside Sterling, with the ominous headline, "New enforcement measures ensure community standards." Dad read the announcement with growing alarm. They can't do this. They're not actual law enforcement. They're counting on people not knowing that, I replied. May 15th marked both my father's 87th birthday and the 50th anniversary of the action that earned him the Silver Star in Vietnam. Several fellow veterans from his VFW post arranged a surprise visit, men in their 70s and 80s who had served alongside him. They gathered around our dining table, sharing stories and memories. With extra vehicles, parking became tight. 2 cars were on the street, and Dad's restored pickup sat partially on the edge of our lawn. Above us, the American flag flew at full staff, larger than the now permitted size under HOA regulations, but a fixture that predated those rules by decades. The celebration was in full swing when aggressive pounding rattled our front door. Through the window, I saw the white HOA vehicle parked at the curb, lights flashing in a pattern clearly designed to mimic law enforcement. "I'll handle this," I said. But Dad was already up. "This is my house and my birthday," he said quietly. "I'll deal with it." Gary Tate stood on our porch in his pseudo-police uniform, tactical pants, polo shirt with HOA enforcement emblazoned across the back, utility belt complete with handcuffs, pepper spray, and what appeared to be a taser. The resemblance to actual law enforcement wasn't coincidental, it was calculated intimidation. "Multiple violations in progress, Caldwell," he announced without greeting. "Unauthorized gathering without an event permit, parking violations, non-conforming flag display, and failure to comply with previous citations." My father stood straight, his military bearing evident despite his age. "These are fellow veterans here for my birthday. They'll be gone in a few hours." "That's not how this works anymore, Colonel," Tate replied, emphasizing my father's rank with subtle mockery. "The board has authorized immediate enforcement. All vehicles need to be moved now, and that flag needs to come down." "That flag has flown here since 1986, my father said, his voice dangerously quiet. "It's not coming down today, or any day while I'm alive." "Then you've made your choice." Tate stepped closer, his hand moving to his belt. "The HOA board has authorized me to remove persistent violators from community property." I moved beside my father. "This isn't community property. This is private property, owned outright. All property in Evergreen Hills is subject to HOA jurisdiction," Tate insisted, his hand moving to his belt. "The board president has specifically instructed me to make an example today." Then everything happened at once. Tate suddenly grabbed my father's arm, yanking him forward onto the porch. "You're under HOA detention for noncompliance," he announced loudly, playing to the neighbors who had begun to gather. Before I could intervene, he had forced my father down the porch steps and onto the concrete driveway entrance. With practiced brutality, he shoved my dad face down onto the ground, twisting his arm behind his back. I watched in horror through the doorway as Tate knelt beside him, roughly applying handcuffs while holding him firmly by the arm. Blood began to seep from a cut on Dad's forehead. Behind them, the white HOA patrol vehicle sat in our driveway, its fake police lights still flashing. Time crystallized into perfect clarity. My father, who had crawled through enemy fire to save 17 men at Dak 2, who continued dragging wounded soldiers to safety with 2 bullets in his body, who had received the Silver Star from the president himself, now lay bleeding on his own American soil. His weathered face pressed against concrete, handcuffed by a mall security guard playing dress-up on the very land he'd nearly died defending. Around us, the tableau froze in unbearable contrast. Colonel Harrison, who had commanded 300 men in the jungle, now stood powerless, his decorated hands trembling around his cane. Master Sergeant Reynolds, who had survived 3 tours and 11 firefights, removed his VFW cap with shaking fingers, pressing it against his chest as if attending a military funeral. Lieutenant Parker, who had sacrificed his right leg saving 9 Marines in the same ambush where my father earned his Silver Star, sank to his remaining knee, tears cutting paths down his battle-scarred face. "Dear God, Rick," Parker choked out. "We watched our brothers die for freedom, and now..." His voice shattered completely as he gestured at the blood pooling beneath my father's silver hair. The unfinished sentence hung in the air, more damning than any words could be. "Stop. You're hurting him," I shouted, my voice carrying the authority developed through years of commanding special operations teams. Every combat instinct honed through decades of training and deployments screamed at me to neutralize the threat. In Fallujah or Kandahar, I would have already taken decisive action. But this was suburban America, not a combat zone, though the line was blurring by the second. Dad didn't struggle or plead. Despite the blood pooling beneath his cheek, despite the humiliation of being handcuffed on his own property in front of neighbors and fellow veterans, he maintained the quiet dignity that had carried him through war and life. His eyes caught mine briefly, and I recognized the expression immediately, the same look he'd given me when teaching me to fish, to shoot, to face adversity. It said clearly as words, strategic thinking, son. Not an emotional reaction. When the war, not just the battle. Tate was putting on a show, playing to his audience while adjusting the cuffs with unnecessary force. "This is what happens when you think your service makes you special," he announced loudly, tightening the restraints until my father's face contorted in pain. "The rules apply to everyone, even so-called heroes." The so-called cut through me like a combat knife. My father had pulled 17 men to safety under concentrated enemy fire. He still carried shrapnel in his shoulder. 3 of those men stood in our yard right now, watching their savior being treated like a common criminal. Our front yard had transformed into a public spectacle. Neighbors had gathered on both sides of the street, many filming with their phones. Evelyn Hayes clutched her cardigan, sobbing openly. Daniel Thompson, who'd always kept to himself, stepped forward with his phone, recording steadily. "This is wrong," he stated firmly. "This man is a neighbor, not a criminal." Something crystallized inside me. The cold, calculating focus that Delta operators call combat clarity. It's a state where emotions recede, where strategic thinking dominates, where mission parameters become crystal clear. I'd experienced it during hostage rescues, high-value target extractions, and counterterrorism operations across 4 continents. Now, standing in my father's front yard, watching his blood stain the concrete, that same clarity descended. Something shifted inside me, a neural switch I hadn't flipped since commanding hostage extractions in territories where failure meant death. Delta operators call it combat clarity. Time slowed. Sounds sharpened. Options crystallized. I moved forward with deliberate precision, hands visible, stance balanced, not threatening. Not yet. "Release him now." Each syllable carried the weight of command that had directed kill teams through scenarios with 0 margin for error. Tate sensed the shift but misread it entirely. "Back off, or you're next." "I have full HOA authority." "What you have," I interrupted with lethal quietness, "is 15 seconds before you experience the worst mistake of your life." I pointed to the neighbors recording with their phones. "You're committing felony assault, false imprisonment, elder abuse, and impersonating law enforcement. The blood on your hands is a federal hate crime against a decorated veteran." Sweat beaded instantly across Tate's forehead. His pupils dilated with the first flickers of genuine fear. HOA boards can't grant arrest powers, I continued, never breaking eye contact. But before I call the real police, let's be properly introduced. I lowered my voice to a register only he could hear, the same tone I'd used negotiating with warlords who understood only power dynamics. I'm Captain Alexander Wilson, 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. The blood you've just spilled belongs to my father, and to a man 15 foreign governments still list as a priority elimination target. You wouldn't survive 30 seconds in the environments where I've spent 15 years. I took one calculated step closer, my voice dropping to a register only Tate could hear, the same tone I'd used negotiating with warlords and militia leaders who understood only the language of power. I've dismantled entire security operations in 19 countries under conditions that would make you collapse. That blood, my father's blood, on your hands and this concrete has just changed the equation fundamentally. Release him now, or I promise you'll never work in security again. Not even guarding the toy section at a department store. The clock is ticking. The color drained from Tate's face as reality penetrated his fantasy of authority. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. The hand resting on his utility belt trembled visibly. He'd been intimidating elderly residents who couldn't fight back, but he now recognized authentic authority when confronted with it. The difference between his costume and my capability becoming painfully clear. A black Mercedes SUV pulled up, and Jonathan Sterling emerged in an expensive suit, followed by a woman in professional attire carrying a leather portfolio. He surveyed the scene with clinical detachment, as though my bleeding father was merely an inconvenient business matter. What seems to be the problem here? He asked. The problem, I replied, is that your employee has just committed multiple felonies on private property. The real police have been called. The woman stepped forward. I'm Rebecca Ellis, legal counsel for the Harmony Glen Estates HOA. Mr. Wilson, the covenant clearly states that the association has enforcement rights. It doesn't grant powers of arrest or detention, I interrupted, nor does it supersede state law regarding assault, battery, false imprisonment, elder abuse, or impersonation of law enforcement officers. I held up my phone. Everything that's happened here is documented. Your fake officer has committed numerous felonies, and as his employer and the person who authorized these actions, Mr. Sterling, you face personal liability and potential criminal conspiracy charges. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Sterling's face. He glanced at the growing crowd, many with phones recording, and at my father's veteran friends who now stood in a protective semicircle. There's clearly been a misunderstanding, he said smoothly. Mr. Tate may have been overzealous. Overzealous, came a voice from behind me. Colonel James Harrison, one of Dad's friends, stepped forward, leaning on his cane. I commanded 300 men in combat. I know the difference between enforcing rules and abusing power. What happened here today is a disgrace to everything we fought for. Other neighbors began speaking up, each sharing stories of intimidation and excessive fines. The attorney whispered urgently to Sterling, who nodded tersely. Tate, release Mr. Caldwell. This situation has escalated unnecessarily. As Tate removed the handcuffs, I helped my father to his feet. Despite the blood on his face, he stood tall, facing Sterling directly. I fought for this country so Americans wouldn't have to live in fear, he said, his voice steady despite the pain. What you're doing here isn't about property values. It's about power and control, and it ends today. The actual police arrived minutes later, 3 patrol cars with lights flashing. As officers began separating parties, the lead officer froze mid-step, staring at my father with dawning recognition. Colonel Caldwell? Sergeant Martinez snapped to attention instinctively. Sir, my father still keeps the photo of you pulling him from that ambush at DAC 2. He says he owes you his life. His eyes shifted to me, widening. Captain Wilson? Delta Force. Operation. I nodded slightly. What you did there is still classified, but legendary among us. In that moment, everything shifted. The HOA dispute instantly transformed into a priority criminal investigation. As crime scene technicians photographed my father's blood on our concrete, Martinez's radio crackled. He stepped away, returning with a cold smile that sent Sterling visibly pale. "Jonathan Sterling," he announced loudly enough for cameras to catch, "the FBI's white-collar division has had you under surveillance for months. Their agents are en route. They've asked us to detain you immediately." His handcuffs clicked shut around Sterling's wrists. "This is absurd." Sterling sputtered, his confidence crumbling. "I've done nothing wrong." "Really?" Martinez replied, showing him a document. "Because according to this warrant, they've already tracked $7 million of homeowner money to your offshore accounts." As Sterling was escorted to a police vehicle, I noticed the HOA attorney frantically texting. When our eyes met, she quickly looked away. The following morning brought a procession of neighbors to our door, with casseroles, offers of help, and, most importantly, their stories. Dad sat at the kitchen table, a small,